So, a few days ago, I created a poll that I sent out to a bunch of artists and people who are interested in art. It had 3 questions. Are you an artist? What kind of art do you make? And do you have the power to make history? And at the time that I'm filming this, about 80% said that they were artists. The majority of them make visual art like drawing or painting, followed by creative writing, and then music or video arts like animation. And as of this morning, question 3 is split almost 50-50. This actually surprised me because it meant that artists themselves were saying they don't have the power to make history. I included a space where they could explain their answer if they wanted, and I got some pretty interesting responses. I make a lot of art, and it's already reached plenty of people. I only have bigger plans going forward. I think everyone has the ability to make history if they choose to. The art forms that we use are powerful and a magnetic tool that helps us express thoughts and opinions in a way that words alone simply can't. I already have made history in little ways, like leaving breadcrumbs of change behind. I want to leave behind a whole loaf one day, though. Maybe not history, but I'd hope others would be inspired to share their talents too, and I feel like that's easier when other people do it with you or before you. I think most people are artists in one sense or another, and coming together in big ways or small ways to create or to make something tangible to show who we are and express that with others is what history is all about. I'll never be in a history book, but I do hope that I have or will have an impact on the future. I think it's very telling that in certain instances where art has made history, it's because art was outlawed or controlled, meaning that people understand how much power it has. There are so many artists creating all sorts of artwork. I think the only art that will make history is the stuff that becomes notorious, but it's difficult to stand out in the current massive amount of artists that we have today. Maybe making history is just doing art for the sake of survival, because it shouldn't be a luxury. We all need it, even if we don't know it. You cannot have history without art, and you cannot have art without artists. Art is a reflection of the times. Every time we touch the present in any way, everything changes. We are constantly changing everything. If everyone believes a lie, then it's the truth. And realistically, this is a really small sample, and probably doesn't represent all artists everywhere, but I have to admit, I was a little bit worried by the amount of doubt I got in response. Not everyone thinks like me, obviously, but do people who make art really believe that what they're doing doesn't have the potential to change the course of history? You may have seen these 4 paintings before. They're pretty famous pieces by Norman Rockwell, and I'm a New Englander, so they took me to the Norman Rockwell Museum in elementary school, and I was lucky enough to see them in person. They're beautiful and meticulous, and they made the US government $133 million. For just a quick little history lesson, the Office of War Information was a government agency that FDR established in 1942 during World War II. Essentially, their job was to make and distribute propaganda to Americans to generate enthusiasm for the war effort. Technically, they were created to keep people informed about the progress of the war and help them understand why the US was even involved in the first place. But for its entire existence, the program was constantly under criticism from Congress and from the press because they were withholding information or sensationalizing the war, and they were even accused of using their power to campaign for FDR. A lot of their writers resigned because they didn't agree with the way that their supervisors were telling them to portray the war, and more of them were fired for accusations of being communists. As soon as the war ended, the whole agency was abolished. You can look at their records on the National Archives if you're interested. And it wasn't like a secret that everything the OWI produced was propaganda. The director of the agency even said that entertainment and images were the best way to inject ideas into people's minds because they don't realize they're being propagandized. They made all kinds of films and radio programs. They hired photographers and illustrators like Norman Rockwell to produce all kinds of posters and ads and graphics. During the war, the OWI published 2.5 million copies of Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms paintings and used them to advertise war bonds. And these things were everywhere. They set up distribution committees on the national, state, and municipal levels to keep fresh posters in the windows of every store and restaurant and office building in every city or town in the country. When you look at these images, you have to understand their constant presence in every public space. You're seeing these messages everywhere you go, and every 2 weeks they're replaced with new ones. The government is constantly talking to you, and they're doing it through the voices of artists. But all of these pieces are old, so why does it matter? All those guys are dead. But it's relevant, I promise, if you just stick with me for a little bit. We all recognize images like this and understand that they're aiming to manipulate us in some way, and that's literally the reason that they were funded and created. If you want to see any more pictures like this and learn about some other state-funded artists from around the same time, the Norman Rockwell Museum has a really cool virtual exhibition with a ton of examples. It's called Imagining Freedom, and it's a pretty good resource, and the art is just really cool. But most propaganda isn't as obvious as this. You might have noticed that out of the examples, one of them looks a little bit different from the rest. Rockwell's piece doesn't include a command like the other ones do, because all the other pieces are asking you to do something in big, bold letters. But this picture just says Thanksgiving. So, do you think you can interpret what his purpose was when he made the painting? What he's doing here is he's softening the image of an American soldier. He's reminding you that this guy has a family to return to, and it's a really humanizing picture. It's supposed to move you in such a way that you might join the effort to support American troops, because, look at this guy, he's so nice. And that's the difference between explicit and implicit propaganda. Because explicit propaganda will tell you outright what it wants you to believe and what it wants you to do. This one wants you to buy war bonds, and it wants you to believe that by doing that, you'll be defending your right to freedom of speech. But with Rockwell's Thanksgiving painting, it takes a lot more investigating on your part to figure out what he's really trying to say. For most Americans, if you know the context of the painting, you probably generally know what World War II was, and you can tell that this is an American soldier, so you probably assume that he's just returned from some kind of combat situation, and here he is celebrating Thanksgiving with his mom. You even have the advantage of knowing what Thanksgiving is, that it's traditionally thought of as a holiday about gratitude and giving back, so at this point you might ask yourself, how am I giving back to the people who fought for my freedom? That's the idea. And this is the power of implicit propaganda. It utilizes the beliefs and the associations that you already have. When it's executed right, your mind will fill in the blanks without you even realizing. This isn't to say that all propaganda is somehow insidious, or that this kind of manipulation is exclusive to propaganda. Any piece of art, whether it's propaganda or not, it reflects the context that it was made in, and it uses elements of your world to help you understand what it means. So this artist and writer called Steve Lambert wrote a paper about art as a form of activism, and he says basically that art shouldn't be thought of as something that's separate or totally insulated from politics. Because art exists in a world that is inherently political, and it's always subject to its larger context. Basically, the world that we live in shapes the art that we make, because every piece of art in some way is a commentary on something external, so it's inspired by it, or it brings our attention to it, or it's making fun of it, but it's always making a reference. Art tells us what's going on around us, and that changes the way that we think about it, and that changes the way that we talk about it, and that changes what we do, and eventually, little by little, it starts to pick away at the world around us and changes the shape of it, and then we make more art about that world. It's a cycle. You can think of art and the conditions around the art as always chasing each other. It makes them inseparable. Lambert also came up with this diagram to sort of explain how propaganda works, and it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you have the artist with a political idea in their head. The art is basically a coded version of that idea, and somebody sees that piece of art, they receive all that information, and they decode the idea in their head, and it should be the same. And this works really well with an image like this, where the message is super explicit because they're talking about a specific event and they're telling you exactly what they want you to do in response to it. But most of the time, transferring ideas is really difficult, and it's rarely as straightforward as this picture. When you can't see what's in the artist's mind, all you can feel is the impact of what they're doing. So the message that you receive from it, it's never going to be exactly what they intended. Because when you're looking at a poster that says "Buy war bonds" in big letters, it's really easy to tell what the artist, and whoever's paying the artist wants from you. But that's a pretty rare example of an artwork that's easy to figure out. When you look at a painting, can you tell what the artist was thinking when they made it? Do you think you could guess what it means to them? Art is complicated, and it requires a lot of context to understand. Because when you look at a piece of art, it's been filtered through the lens of the artist's mind, and then it's filtered through their skills and the tools at their disposal to realize their vision. Then once it reaches you, it gets filtered through your mind, because you're not an objective or a passive observer. When you look at a piece of art, there's a lot that you bring to the table. Steve Lambert made sort of a sequel to the propaganda model, and this one's called the model of artistic activism, which is a little esoteric, but basically it shows the relationship between an artist and the people who are looking at their art. What happens is they make a piece that's based on a number of ideas that they have, and they encode those ideas into a number of different forms and symbols and other elements. You might have seen a picture like this before if you've taken an art class. There's a million slight variations of it out there, but the takeaway is that these two lists are pretty much the ingredients you can use to make a piece of art. It's a little intangible when it's just sitting there in a list, but if you look at any piece of visual art, you should be able to identify some, if not all, of these. And on the receiving end, a viewer is going to take in all of these things as a full composition. Because now we're not just dealing with a bunch of separate visual elements, we're also taking into account the relationship between all these different pieces and how they interact with each other, and it gives us an overall impression. You might not be able to glean much meaning from a blue square and a yellow circle, but what if I put them together? Maybe you're starting to get an idea of what I'm referencing, or maybe you're not. Maybe we need to add more elements. The more information that you have to work from, the more that you can interpret. And what you take away from this picture also depends on you and what you already know. If you've seen Starry Night, some of the shapes might remind you of that, so you might think that I'm referencing Van Gogh. And if you haven't seen it, maybe it makes you think of something else. You can usually find pretty explicitly political art in museums that focus on contemporary or modern art, because it's fashionable for big art institutions to put their name on a project that tackles some kind of global issue or advocates for social change. If you look up any big art museum in the United States and you look through their current exhibitions, which I would encourage you to do if you're curious about this, you're likely to find pretty quickly an exhibit that claims to have some kind of political or social weight to it. But this is kind of a gray area because political art isn't necessarily propaganda. I want to clarify the difference between meaning and purpose. Because an artist embeds a meaning in their work, or the work develops from a particular meaning in their head, and it may or may not be interpreted by the viewer. But if the artist makes a piece hoping that you interpret the meaning and then you do something about it, that would be their purpose. Meaning is just an idea, but purpose is a call to action. And since all art is inherently political, you could pretty broadly define propaganda as political art with a specific purpose. So we can look at an example and see how easy it is to determine whether a museum exhibition is political art or political propaganda. El Perez is an artist who was exhibited at MASMOCA in 2023, and if you haven't been there, just try to imagine throwing $20 at some pieces of metal with a TV strap to it or something, and you'll have a pretty good idea of what it's like. I actually saw this exhibition in real life, so full disclosure, I really like it, but we can take a look at some of their pieces. Because an exhibition like this might strike some people as being inherently political. You have pictures of testosterone bottles and visibly queer people, and images like that might make you think of political things like legislative battles about LGBTQ rights or social inequalities or other really fun things like that. Perez also uses footage from Puerto Rico pretty shortly after Hurricane Maria, which might make you think of the controversy surrounding FEMA's kind of inadequate relief effort. So their work has ties to political concepts, but what does Perez actually want us to do about it? So if you read through the review on the exhibition, you kind of get the idea that Perez's whole vision here is really about love and sharing moments and different things that connect people in their community. And it talks about things like light and dark and form and texture and how they represent the fluidity of things. You can see that there's plenty of references to gender identity and queerness and marginalized communities, but those things are treated more like they're just visual qualities of the work than some kind of a call to action. It would really be a stretch to argue that Intimacy is a propaganda piece, because Perez isn't really demanding anything of the audience or even trying to teach a particular ideology. Really what they've done here is they just created an environment where a whole variety of different ideas could potentially grow. The outcome among people who see the exhibition totally depends on who's looking and what they're bringing to it. Because this is how art works. It's not a set of instructions, and it's not always created with some kind of ideological endgame. In most cases, it's just about creating possibility. So you can think of this as an extension of the artistic activism model. Just to give you an idea of how artists communicate their ideas, it's a metaphor. Those flowers represent the people who look at art, which could be you or could literally be anybody, but the important part is that the right environment for growth is provided by the artist. So you have sunlight, dirt, water, other things that plants need, and you can think of yourself as one of the seeds. Each one of them is a different plant with different stuff going on, and they're going to take those resources, and each of them will grow a little bit different and produce a unique product in the end. And you could have beans or flowers or gourds. Another thing that Steve Lambert said was that by perpetuating the idea that art can't create real change, it limits the power that artists have to use their work for activism, which not every artist is trying to do, but plenty of them are. It's how you change things, just like you can rearrange objects with your hands. And artists are doing this all the time. I made this funny little visual to help sort of explain that dynamic a little bit more. Let's say that you're an artist and I'm looking at a piece of art that you made. That piece would be your point of contact with me, the viewer, and it's the only part that I can see, or in this metaphor, touch. But obviously that's not the whole picture. It'd be like if you smacked me in the face and I was like, whoa, a disembodied hand just smacked me in the face. Clearly there's more to it than that, because behind that one artwork is your entire body of work. It's everything else that you've ever made. That might be more visual art, it might be writing or dancing, basically all your previous work and the process that you went through to make those things or to do those things. It makes up a big portion of the context surrounding this piece, because it shows us how you got here. It's all the ideas that you came up with and the different mediums and techniques that you've tried before. Then behind your other work is your identity, so that's who you are and what you know. The way that you see yourself as a person and the collective knowledge that you bring to your work, it's going to inform everything that you make. El Perez photographs queer people because they identify with a queer experience of life and they're making commentary on what they know. The last layer is going to be your surroundings, meaning the world around you and how it informs who you are. That could mean the city that you grew up in, it could be your culture, it could be the political situation wherever you live. Remember that Norman Rockwell made art that advocated for the US military because he lived in a time and place where being patriotic was looked at pretty favorably. He was an American who lived in America and made art about American life. Obviously there's going to be a lot of overlap between all these categories, like who you are has a lot to do with where you come from, for example. And those those deeper layers aren't going to be totally visible the way that the artwork itself is, but they're always there. The takeaway should be that art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's an extension of the artist that made it, and the conditions that made the artist. It's part of their reach, like a limb. This picture sort of illustrates the relationship between the artist and the viewer, and you can see that the art itself is where they touch. We already know what the different layers of the artist are, but what the viewer brings to the table is just as important. They may not always have artworks of their own behind them, but they've probably seen other art, and that's going to impact the way that they understand yours. Just like my example from before, a viewer who's seen Starry Night is going to generate different ideas than someone who hasn't. Who they are is also going to be important. It determines what kind of art they gravitate towards. If you weren't the kind of person who likes modern art because it's too elitist and abstract for you, you're probably not going to visit the Museum of Modern Art. If you're a young person who uses your phone a lot, you might prefer to look at art on Instagram or maybe something cooler that I don't even know about. These things determine which artists you see and which ones you don't. It's also going to affect how you respond to a piece of art. I really liked El Perez's exhibition because I saw myself in it. I found it relatable. Not everyone is going to feel that way. And beyond that, you get out into the world, and how this person exists in the context of their world is going to determine what art they see and what they take away from it. Maybe you grew up in a place that didn't have many art museums, so you don't gravitate to the really elaborate and expensive installation type art, but you really like the public art that people in your community are making. Or someone who was raised in a really conservative Christian community probably won't appreciate the work of a tattoo artist as much as I would. My point in saying all of this is that making art and seeing art is a reciprocal relationship. And it's these kind of exchanges that build culture and at the same time result from it. An artist's intended meaning and their intended purpose, if there is one, are nothing without the context that makes them accessible and the people who are there to access them. A painting that sits alone in a room might be really beautiful, it might be really skillful, and maybe that's enough to satisfy the artist, but it's not going to generate anything new. The creative process is a shared one. It's the sharing of art that gives it life, and you and I are what keeps that life cycle moving. So I'm going to have us look back in time again, and a little further this time. If you're not familiar with the term constructivism, it's an art movement that started right around the end of World War I and lasted until like the mid-1930s. A lot of people think of it as being specific to Russia, but a lot of the bigger names were actually artists from Ukraine, Latvia, Belarus, and a couple other countries that were part of the Soviet Union at the time. A lot of the pieces that became sort of associated with the movement were sponsored by the Bolshevik government during the Russian Revolution. One of the most sort of iconic is this poster by El Lisitsky, and it's called Break the Whites with the Red Wedge. You can see this red triangle represents communism breaking up the monarchist power structure during the October Revolution, so it's pretty heavy-handed symbolism and definitely propaganda. Constructivist art is pretty easy to identify because you have all these geometric shapes and a lot of kinetic energy. You can see this in plenty of Lisitsky's work. And there was this common theme surrounding technology and innovation and sort of the future of Russian industrialism. These posters that Alexander Radchenko made for the Russian state airline are pretty good examples, and you can see they're also really heavy on text, so much so that it really becomes integrated into the design, like some of these movie posters. Their art really had a lot less to do with expression and was more about just showcasing physical properties of the materials that they were using. A lot of them totally rejected the idea that what they were making was even art to begin with. And a lot of constructivists sort of started to shift their focus from decorative things or public art and posters to more functional objects. Vladimir Tatlin designed this prototype building. It never actually got built, but it would have been called Monument to the Third International. And his next projects were attempts at building a more efficient stove and designing overalls for working people. He wasn't super successful as an engineer, but he's still important to the movement. And there are plenty of constructivist pieces that were explicitly made to be state art, like this other Lisitsky piece from 1919. It's like an abstraction of the murder of a communist leader named Rosa Luxemburg. So it's pretty easy to see the artist's purpose here, but more often than not, constructivist art tended to sort of reflect its political backdrop in much more implicit ways. Because that sort of utilitarian approach to art, if it is art at all, was really conducive to the political structures that were present at the time. Because even artists who weren't sponsored by the state were still making art that showed their political alignment in some way. Because constructivist work at its core was governed by scientific principles, and it rejected the idea that art was supposed to communicate something personal or emotional or spiritual. It's totally grounded by the real physical world, and it focuses on material needs of people. This kind of unwavering rationality was born out of communist values, and the art tended to reinforce a lot of those ideas, because remember that art and the world around the art are always chasing each other. A lot of these pieces are imagining a sort of utopian future where Russians are living in a fully industrialized society. They're emphasizing sort of the practical function of objects and how they can best serve society. So much so that sometimes art started to cross over into engineering until the two of them became kind of indistinguishable. And that's sort of my next point, because we've been talking a lot about fine art, which is just art that was made to be looked at. But there's lots of other things that could be considered art, but serve a different purpose primarily, like clothes or furniture or toys. These are two model kits of different kinds of airplanes. We also have this series of Kellogg cereals that had these cute little pins of different warplanes and military insignias inside. And when you look at them, you might notice some design elements that you've seen before. These are American products, and they're advertised to American kids, but they kind of resemble some of the constructivist posters that we were looking at before. You can see that they're text-heavy, because sort of like the Russian state airline posters, it's an advertisement, and it's trying to convey something very specific. There's names and places that are essential to your understanding of the picture. There's that same very straightforward black, white, and red scheme that makes it ideal for mass printing and mass distributing. It's eye-catching. It commands your attention, especially when they're all constructed from these big geometric shapes. It's directional. The simplicity of it saves all the little details for the main purpose of the image, which is to show you these. All these ads are trying to spark some kind of excitement in you about American technological innovation. They want you to be fascinated by the form and function of these planes, enough so that you're willing to buy and assemble one of these models just to get a closer look at them. All these ads were published either during or shortly after World War II, and these are all military planes. You can see this one is referred to as North America's famous Tokyo bomber, and this big block of text here tells you about how that airplane hunts enemy submarines. And this brings up an important question about what these companies wanted from American kids, specifically little boys, like what they wanted them to be thinking about and engaging with as they're growing up. Because companies like Joe Watt Manufacturing and Kellogg, which were fairly popular and pretty reputable among American consumers, they had a lot of influence over what people consider normal. Because if you grow up playing with toys that look like military weapons, you may not be so shocked by what they're doing with them overseas, because the context that you understand them in isn't war, it's just play. And not to get too into the weeds about the ethics of this, although you definitely could, it's an argument that a lot of parents make about first-person shooters now. It's still very present. My point is that it demonstrates a cause-effect relationship between what we buy and what we do. And at the same time, it would be hard to argue that these companies were selling these things because they had an explicit plot to desensitize American children to military violence. You can't really prove that. At the end of the day, companies sell products to make money. And in order to do that, they make things they think that people are likely to buy. Those products wouldn't sell very well if there weren't already a large number of Americans, particularly kids, who were interested in the military and responded to this kind of unquestioned patriotism. The culture for this kind of thing already existed, and Kellogg and Joe Watt were just capitalizing on it. I want this to serve as an example of how culture facilitates art, which facilitates culture, which facilitates art. So I want to show you one more thing, because we just looked at a bunch more World War II stuff, and I promise that's over now. I want to introduce a trend in American product designs that started after the war ended, and you still see it today. You might recognize the term mid-century modern. Basically, it describes a very specific set of design principles where objects have clean lines, simple silhouettes, and very few decorative elements or small details. You can see this kind of style applied to architecture, furniture, graphic design, and just an insane variety of consumer products. You see things are defined by these very clear geometric shapes. It's directional and easy to read. It's also impersonal. If you think about objects with no decorative or symbolic elements, what information do you really have to work with? It's art that's trying not to say anything. It doesn't belong to a culture or to a time or place. The style is totally decentralized. It's for everyone, which means it's also for no one. Designs that are simple and minimal and easy to replicate make products that people are more comfortable with throwing away. To put it simply, this chair isn't special because it wasn't handmade and it wasn't customized, and it would be hard to distinguish it from any other chair that you could buy around that time. That really simple style was conducive to mass production because you could make a ton of identical products really, really easily, and the products that people had already bought would wear down quicker. It's much easier for consumers to dispose of them because they're just not precious. And designers at the time were sort of pitching this system as a triumph of human advancement because, look at how far removed we are from the past. Look at how fast things are moving. And you can look at these styles all separate of their respective movements and see that they have a lot in common, like geometric patterns and solid colors and integrating form and function, and they all tend to acknowledge the physical properties of what they're made of. But the sort of underlying message that all of these different artworks are trying to convey is totally different. They even contradict each other. And it all depends on the context that you're looking at them in. Because the constructivists worked within the structure of a communist nation, so their designs aimed to improve the lives of the people through all kinds of clever engineering. But mid-century modern was developing in a time when consumerism was just sort of exploding at the center of most Americans' lives. And these product designs were meant to enable just rapidly producing, and they encourage people to continuously buy and dispose of new things. So other than that they just look sort of similar, what do the constructivist pieces and the mid-century modern designs and the toy ads all sort of have in common? What they're all doing is they're imagining an ideal future where technology can grow and humanity can grow with it, so we can all live in a society defined by innovation. They're kind of celebrating it, and they're also promising it. If you're an artist, you have the power to imagine a world that you want to live in. Not just that, but you can actually make it a reality. And this isn't just wishful thinking on my part. It's a documented phenomenon that you can rediscover over and over again for human history. At the end of the day, art is just the practice of creating possibility. When you take an idea from your mind and you share it with the rest of us, what you're doing is you're building and you're nurturing a place where something new can grow. And that's beyond you. It's beyond me. It's a collective effort that we're all contributing to, all the time, even when we don't realize it. We make art, and art makes us. I also want to thank whoever responded doing your mom as their preferred art medium. It's a classic.